So I just want you to know that I understand that what I'm about to say sounds like a lie, but just believe me, it is the truth. Let me just get into it. So I am under the impression, or in fact, I know for a fact that this, what you're watching right now, is the single most important recording or tutorial ever made. And when the Earth is demolished and it's all ruins and the aliens come to visit to check out, what was humanity all about, there's going to be ruins, but this is actually going to be the last thing that is left. Because, why is that? Because we put it in a time capsule, because it is in fact so important. It describes our culture, it describes what it means to be human. And yeah, so it is my privilege today to do day 3 of Nodevember, where the prompt is fruit. So I thought to myself, you know what, we got to make fruit. Why not make a watermelon? It's pretty simple. It goes over the same ideas that we talked about last time with vector displacement, chaining steps together. However, you can see there are some new ideas like scattering seeds. How do we do something like that? How do we create the texture of the watermelon? All of this and more coming up right now. Really coming up soon, since there's a bit more intro to get through, but coming up in a moment, nevertheless. So here you see the blend file that I always have prepared by magic. It's almost like I'm a time traveler. This is the blend project that the render came from. You see we have the cube and it turns into a watermelon and the seeds are distributed and it's reshaped and all that. This blend project, which we are going to try to recreate, at least simply, we're not going to go over all the details because fucking hell. Look at this. This is kind of like when you see that number scroll your friend was working on and he made it to 5,000. You're like, yeah, it's cool. No way I'm making it. We're going to try to recreate it the best we can, but if you want the original blend file, it's going to be on Patreon, I think is what I was trying to get to. So Patreon exists, but without further ado, we're going to try to copy this. And what are the sliders? What are the parameters that we are going to be able to control? Well, first of all, we have obviously the transform. This is the thing that takes us from a cube to a watermelon, and I know it probably makes more sense to start with a sphere, but fuck that, okay? We want to make it look at least somewhat complicated and interesting, so we're going to start off with a cube, which is the same thing as the lollipop from yesterday. We have mixing just for the shader, what makes it look like a watermelon. This slider controls that. We have the aspect ratio, which is kind of like scaling on the x-axis, both a few caveats that makes it not the same as, literally taking this object, if we can find it, and scaling it. They're different operations. What else? We got stripes, so you can control how many stripes you have. The gradient, this is just like the Rhine, the white part, seeds, stuff like that. I could bore you with the rest of the sliders, but just download the blend file if you care. Otherwise, let's just start off fresh. And I know I said I'd do a setup file for the 3rd time in a row now, but screw it, I don't want to. So we're just going to do it like this. Setting up the scene is the same as always. We're going to get rid of the lighting to substitute it with HDRI lighting. But before we substitute HDRI, which again stands for High Dynamic Rudimentary Index, it stands for High Dynamic Range Image. Before we do that, we just got to set a couple settings straight. We got to beat it up and get a couple things straight, more like Cycles Engine. Make sure you're using your most powerful piece of hardware. For me, that is a GPU. We are going to make sure film is set to transparent because, again, we're going to be doing an HDRI and we don't want to see it in the background. Displacement, I'm going to set to displacement only. Again, we talked about last time. Displacement only is in some sense better for what we're doing than displacement and bump because it prevents a lot of lighting artifacts. So if you don't want to adjust your normals, displacement only is the way to go. Additionally, we are going to go to Shading Workspace and load in the World tab. We are going to load in an HDRI that I downloaded from where? Say it with me, friends. Best friends. HDRIhaven.com. That's where I got it. So now we have a simple cube with the HDRI. I feel like there's an easier way to say that. Either way, HDRI setup is complete, and final thing we need to do other than saving is add a couple levels of subdivision because, again, vector displacement requires geometry. 8 vertices isn't enough for that. Control 3 for a subdivision surface modifier of level 3, and I know what you're thinking, wow, it made a sphere. Great, we don't need to do that with vector displacement. No, that's not how we do it here in the CG Matter default cube gang. We set it to simple and create the sphere using vector displacement. We will not be cheating, okay? So let's save our super valuable progress and call it, I have a Patreon. It's true. It's always good to name your blend files off of something that is objectively true. That way, there's no way that it can corrupt because there's no grain of mistruth, of untruth for it to start corrupting from. Wow. Okay, I have no idea what I'm talking about. Let's start by making our watermelon. Name of the game is going to be taking our cube, turning it into a sphere, so it's spherical, closer to a watermelon. We're then going to compress it so it's only the bottom or top hemisphere, so it's, looking again more like a watermelon, and then the rest of it is pretty much BSDF stuff, okay? So first thing is turning this into a sphere. We talked about how to do this last time, but just a reminder. Vector displacement set to object space is going to do our transformation. And even though it might seem like a sphere has the super complicated mathematical formula, and however are people like us supposed to transform from cube to sphere, remember, a sphere is just a surface that all the points are equidistant. They have the same length from the center, okay? And we can use that piece of information to create a sphere. So I'm going to look at the x, y, z vectors for the position of every point on this cube. And since we want to be manipulating the length, it probably makes sense. It definitely really makes sense. There's not a doubt in my mind that it makes sense. I'm confident that it makes sense that we need to look at the length, okay? So now we have the length of every vector on this cube, and we want to do a manipulation. So I'm going to scale these lengths by the reciprocal. And again, the idea here is every vector has some initial length, and if we multiply scale by the reciprocal, so I'm dividing 1 over this. If we multiply by the reciprocal, what effectively is happening is we're getting a unit vector out of all of these, right? So even though they're all facing the same direction, they're going to be compressed down until they're the length of the corresponding vector on the sphere. So we take our vectors, scaled by this reciprocal, connect it, see, wow, it didn't seem to work. And you're like, okay, time to hang up the towel. I know I wasn't cut out for elite level football. And then you remember, oh, right, vector displacement is in fact a displacement. It is a transformation. We still have the initial coordinates. So if we want only the sphere, we need to subtract away the initial cube. So we have transformation instructions that we don't want to add on to the original cube, so we subtract it away is the idea. Shade smooth just so that we get smoother geometry. Let's bump this up to 4 as well. And by the way, just a trick that I've been thinking about doing for these tutorials, you can use a wireframe node and connect it into the base color, in fact, to see the exact transformation that's happening. So here's the cube with the amount of subdivisions, by the way, and we can include, whoa, too far. And we can do our transformation to get the sphere. So I'm thinking maybe we'll keep that for now, that kind of visual display. Okay, next order of business, again, step 2. Following step 1, we want to chain our displacements together correctly. Step 2 is going to be compressing this down to a hemisphere, okay? And again, the way you might do this without thinking too much, so this would be the wrong way, is you take your position, you say, okay, I want to isolate the z coordinate, and in fact, we want to say, okay, we want to exactly, not have a gradient, but exactly separate top from bottom. So you do a greater than 0, so the coordinates, at least the z coordinates that are greater than 0 are 1, and the bottom hemisphere 0, and you're like, okay, perfect. You can do some kind of vector transformation, and I'll show you what that transformation is. But again, remember the issue with what we're doing here is we're using the initial position coordinates, even though we've already done step 1 of the transformation. So we should really be hooking up, position coordinates with this included, but we'll get into that. So really the transformation that you might be thinking that we need, which would be correct, is we're going to have some vector math. And what we can do is I guess there's a couple of options. I'm going to go with a multiplication with a combine XYZ. So what we're going to be doing is taking our coordinates again, which we are going to modify, but let's not talk about that yet. And we are going to multiply by the vector 1, 1. So x and y are multiplied by 1, nothing happens. And then for the z-axis, we multiply by our gradient. In other words, I guess we do want the opposite, so let me set it to less than. In other words, the top is multiplied by 0, so it gets shrunk down to the ground plane. Z is equal to 0 when you multiply by 0. And then the bottom hemisphere, nothing happens, because when you multiply by 1, just like graduation, nothing really changes. Okay. So you might be thinking that is the initial transformation, and you hook it up to object space vector displacement, and you see that everything is messed up. It still has this cubiness to it, and you're like, what gives? Okay, well, remember the idea here, and here are all the position kind of outputs that we're using for this second step 2 chain of vector displacement. Remember, we need to include everything we've done before because we have an order of operations that we add together and then get our vector displacement, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to add. So before it even reaches step 2, we are going to be adding our transformation. So again, we start with position. So think about it like this. We start with position coordinates. We do our transformation that makes it a sphere. Now we're done with step 1. We bring it back to step 2 where we add it. So now it's our position coordinates with this transformation. And now we're looking for the z coordinate and doing all this stuff. And I don't think this is exactly what we need, and you'll see why in a second. But you see now at least it has some of that spherical property to it. It's still looking very cube-like, but now it's kind of working. Again, even though we've done the correction that we were just talking about, this is, again, just a displacement. We always need to get rid of the initial coordinates, okay? So we should just be able to subtract, I think, the initial position vector. We'll test that out. There we go. And you see that does exactly what we want it to do. So again, let's view what's happening here. We have a cube, and with a single transformation, which we, secretly tucked away as 2 steps, but it sees it as one vector displacement. You can't chain these nodes. With 1 step, it does it. Again, position, transformation, correct for step 2, do step 2, and then finally subtract away the initial coordinates, okay? So now we have the basic shape for our watermelon, but this is the kind of watermelon that you might play basketball with, right? It's supposed to be more ellipsoid-like, less spherical. So before we do our, position vector correction, let's just do a final modification where we do an XYZ scaling of maybe only the x-axis. So this is just going to stretch out our x coordinates before we do the correction. And this is the kind of thing, this is actually the exact kind of thing that we usually want to tuck away into a slider. So 1 for x, y, and z, and then set x to some value like 1.4. And now we have this nice slider that lets us determine the size of our watermelon. And technically we could do, wow, I bought myself, slight tangent, I swear to God it's related, okay? I bought myself an air freshener, okay, fine, nothing crazy, but it's electronic, so every once in a while it will just spray, it will go, and then I fucking lose my shit because I think somebody's in my room. When in fact, after my jump scare, I just smell the air of like, oh, I'm alive. And then I'm like, oh, it smells pretty good. It smells like pine in here, a manly scent. What are we talking about? Yes, we could add an additional displacement with the seeds and all this, but I think we are good with our vector displacement. So here is our vector displacement map, and we're done with it. Name of the game for the rest of this is just some BSDF nonsense where, again, in my original blend, let me save this, in my original blend, I guess I don't need to open it. I mixed a bunch of principled BSDFs together. Here we can try to do it with just 1, okay? So how do we make this look like a watermelon? First of all, let's do these stripes on the bottom. And that seems like a very complicated mathematical thing to do until you remember that we actually have wave texture, which already gives us stripes in whichever direction we want. And you're thinking to yourself, wow, this is a good looking result. Again, remember this happens because of our texture coordinate setup, okay? So by default, this is going to be using generated coordinates. So when we connect this, nothing's going to happen because it's the same thing. Remember, generated coordinates, because of how Blender works, they move with the vector displacement. So when we increase this, you can see it's almost as if there's a texture projected onto here that's moving with it, which means that generated coordinates, long story short, are fucked, right? Because they hitchhiked along for the ride. Whereas something like object coordinates do not have this issue. They kind of stay relative to the origin, right? So they update is the point. They don't stick onto there, which in this case is a good thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use object coordinates instead of generated coordinates for our wave texture. And now you can see it doesn't look broken, unlike before, where it was broken AF. This is, this is after you break your leg in that soccer tournament, and this is you not knowing that you're about to get your life ruined by the soccer tournament, okay? To make these stripes look more watermelon-y, we need fewer stripes in the first place. We need to add distortion. This is just going to take our wave texture and add a bit of wobble to it. I'm going to add in detail just so there's a bit of crispness to it, and already it's looking very watermelon-y. But the trick, the coup de grace, the creme de la crop, the stuff that rises to the top, what makes it the best is detail roughness. You increase this and it's going to kind of blend everything together in this rough pattern that looks very watermelon-y. In fact, we might want to up the distortion a bit and maybe have even fewer stripes than this. And this is kind of like the base texture you need for your watermelon. And the nice thing about this, again, since it's object coordinates, you can make this cool animation that transforms with it. Not like generated coordinates in that sense, but in the sense that we've been talking about, okay? So that is pretty cool. What do we want to do with this? We want to connect it to the BSDF so it looks like, it's reacting to lighting conditions to make it watermelon colored. And we could, load up an image. I've seen some other people's Nodevember tutorials and they're using reference. And I think to myself, losers, they don't know what a watermelon looks like. We're just going to set this to a green. We don't need reference to do it because I think in our heads we know what a watermelon looks like. So I'm just picking a shade of green for the white part of this color ramp. And for the dark part, you want to keep it near black, but maybe make it a tiny bit shade tint of green, I guess. And I'm just going to make this darker to begin with. Okay? So now we have a good looking BSDF thing. We could add in a couple more details, like we could mix RGB with some noise, just so some parts are darker than others, and we might go back to that. But one tiny change that does help a lot, so it is worth doing, add in a bump node so we can convert height information, into normal information. Plug in the very same wave texture so it corresponds with our color setup. And you can see that when we use this, I guess we should probably use the factor just so it's a single dimensional quantity. When we do this, not only do we have the color, but corresponding to this, we kind of have, and you can see how this catches the light, a bit of bump, right? So if we set this to 0, it's going to be perfectly smooth. If it's 1, we have a lot. And I'm thinking, watermelons are pretty smooth, so something like 0.3 should be a pretty good start, okay? So there we go. Just a quick reminder, even though this is set to displacement only, where is it? There it is. It's like Finding Waldo, except you have brain damage, and you're supposed to know where Waldo is. Displacement only, even though it doesn't have bump in the title, it seems that as long as you use a bump node, it works. It just doesn't work on the displacement level. Okay, so here we have the base setup, and now let's talk about how to do the top part of the watermelon, so the Rhine. I think that's what it's called, the white or greenish white part, and also the interior with the seeds and all that, okay? Again, normally I would mix a bunch of BSDFs, one for this, one for the red, etc., but we want to do it in one only. So we need a mask, again, because we're doing it this way. We need a mask for the interior over here. To do that, there's actually a very lucky coincidence with how we have things set up. Again, generated coordinates are fucked. However, there is something that they are very good for. So we're going to separate these by x, y, z. And you're going to notice, so again, this is the z coordinates relative to generated coordinates. It's looking weird again. It's looking, let me do it this way. It's looking very distorted again because of the transformation. This is kind of the residual result. Even though we have this kind of messed up scenario, one thing that is, turning out very good for us is if we set this to greater than and then decrease it, increase it, basically bump it up so it's taking up the top part of this. You can see as long as we don't make this too big, it almost gives us the exact mask that we want because it's kind of like the top face of the original cube. You can think about why it works, but point is, it's working out very well. As long as you don't make it too small, whoops, that's way too small. As long as you don't make it too small, then you're going to get some kind of cubey artifacts. So you just want to make it not too intense, okay? And this gives us a very nice mask. And in fact, what we can do is mix RGB. Let's just throw this in here, mix RGB with this as the factor, have this be red, and now you can see we kind of have a interior, a very bad one, right? This is the kind of watermelon you give to the cousin you're trying to get rid of or something, right? It doesn't look very good, but we can fix that. First order of business is making this line less harsh, and also, by doing that, getting rid of this kind of square look to it, okay? The trick we're going to use to do this is one I've talked about before, so I'm going to go over it very quickly. We want to add in a noise, not a boy. My fingers just do what they do, and they type in boy naturally. I'm very proud of that. We want to add a noise texture because this is basically randomness that we want to add. We want to add to our generated coordinates. So we're taking our coordinates and saying, you know what? Mess it up. Mess it up really badly. Okay? And what it's going to do is it's going to do that. However, you're going to see this drift. And again, what's happening here is the noise texture has a value between 0 and 1 for every point on the watermelon. So on average, it's going to be adding, again, on average, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, that vector. So if we just correct for this by subtracting the vector, subtracting 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, now we're getting something that makes more sense. So it's the mask from before, but now with this distortion. But we want to have more control over this, not just in the noise texture, but in the amount of distortion. So what we always do And I get it. Maybe you haven't seen this part before and you're like, oh, I'm feeling excluded, left out. Well, you can just look at what I'm doing and just follow it, right? I'm just talking to the real homies over here, right? What we did is we scaled it, if I can find scale. In other words, we said what strength, what magnitude, what ganas, desire, should this have? Well, that can be determined by the scale. Again, it's going to introduce some drifting problems just like before. So the final thing you do is you scale by the correction vector again. 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. This is just going to be offsetting everything backwards. And then we want to have a value node controlling both of these. So no matter what strength we give our noise, the corresponding correction vector is also, corresponding, right? So now we can kind of control the quality or the type of noise that we're getting over here. I'm going to bump up the detail in our noise just so we're getting something nicer, add a bit of roughness, which we're going to be able to see as we bump up. Not too much, but slightly bump up our noise over here. So now we kind of have a kind of more interesting looking mask, maybe increase the noise size just to get a bit of fine detail. And I'm thinking that this is looking pretty good. So now it's no longer looking very square-like and we're getting a nice transition, okay? And the nice thing about this, again, is since this is corresponding to this greater than, ultimately, this is what's being outputted, we can have different levels. So like the exterior of the watermelon, and then as we go interior, it's going to get red. So it's going to be Rhine and then the red stuff, okay? So let's actually start off with the Rhine, talking about that, okay? So the Rhine is kind of this, I guess it doesn't have this wave texture to it. It's kind of like we sampled a color of green here, and then we made it slightly more desaturated, just so it's looking kind of whiter and maybe a bit brighter, right? So this is what we want. For the mask for this, I'm just going to increase this until it's right on the edge. So it's as if we cut this watermelon and this is the interior. And maybe we want it to just have a tiny bit of wave texture on the rim, just so it looks like, it's a bit jagged and stuff like that. Maybe what we could also do, just to make this a bit fancier, is you don't need to use greater than as the cutoff, although I think we'll probably use it again later on. In fact, you could use subtraction, and this gives you a gradient. It's kind of the same thing, although now instead of having a harsh cutoff, we have a nice gradient that, again, we can control, okay? So if we do it this way, what we can do is not just have a single color, but a gradient of Rhine, which is pretty cool. So let's connect this here and connect this here. So now we're looking at the interior Rhine thing, although maybe, I guess there is an argument to be made for maybe the factor being a greater than and the color being a, wow, I need water. My voice is getting raspy, like I just ate a whole watermelon and cut it up. Okay, now we're good. Where were we? We probably want to have a harsh cutoff for the factor, so I'm just going to connect this here, use greater than, and put this right here. So we have a harsh cutoff, but as for the color, we have a nice gradient because we're using the subtraction. So starting off with the black, we could actually disconnect this so we can snag this color, Control C, and then reconnect this. We can then do Control V, so we've snagged the color, and then as it goes to the interior, we have exactly, and I think we already have this, exactly white. So let's just bump up the contrast by sliding over the first slider, and then sliding over the second slider. And notice that it's not just kind of like circles inside circles. It still has this noise because it's intrinsic to what we've made. So it's actually kind of a nice setup. And let's just modify this a tiny bit, just like that. So that now we have kind of like a, almost as if we mixed BSDFs together. Whew, but we didn't, right? And what we could also do while we're here is we could add in a third slider and just do it all in one color ramp. Although there is an argument to not do it this way, and we could make it red on the interior. Now the argument for not doing it this way is, again, we get this choppiness that's going on in here. So if we want to prevent that, again, we don't want to use the subtraction, but the greater than, that gives us a harsh cutoff. But I'm trying to think, is there really anything else we want to do to this part? I'm thinking it's looking pretty good. So now let's actually, you know what? There's one thing we could do. Since these values are supposed to be based off each other, one's the cutoff and one is the subtraction, what we can do is, let's just type it in right here. We can make this a value slider that we can control later. So now we kind of have the slider for the Rhine. That controls not only the gradient, but the cutoff, of course. So let's just tuck these away over here. Next order of business is making the watermelon-y part, the watermelon-y part of the watermelon. So again, we're going to mix RGB. We're just making a stack Let's just move all this stuff over here so it doesn't bother us. Go away, Mrs. Torrance. What we're doing is just stacking mix RGBs in the same way that we were stacking vector displacement before, but now this time it's not impossible to understand. That's the main difference. What we're going to do for this part is do another greater than node and basically use the same kind of setup from before, although this time what we're going to do is kind of cut in deeper into the watermelon, okay? And what this one's going to do is it's going to be the factor for the second mix RGB that is going to reveal wherever there's going to be the watermelon-y kind of setup. And again, we can do the exact same thing we were doing before, where we can have a nice gradient for this. So I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm going to set one of these to subtract, connect this here, make sure that these are the same value no matter what you do. And then instead of having a single color, we could even use the same gradient, just stealing like an artist. Use the same gradient from before. Okay, so now we have two colors. One of them's green, which I guess we want to make reddish. And let's make the other one kind of like a pinkish and make it, I guess, less saturated. And we want to decrease the contrast because that is what's making it look bad. So I'm just going to play around with these sliders for a bit until we're generally getting something that looks pretty watermelon-y. There is an argument, I guess, to be made to make this noise less intense, just so there isn't like this kind of blast zone kind of thing. So we can make that less noise and also less intense. So it's nice that we can kind of control this, going back in time and control this procedurally. A final thing that I want to do just for this watermelon before we get into the seeds and all that is make it so that this surface has some bumpiness to it, because, the watermelon isn't perfectly smooth. You can't ice skate on watermelon, usually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a noise texture that we're going to use for bump, increase this to a very high number. So this is kind of like the noise. It's exactly like the noise. That is a nasty habit, just saying kind of all the time. We're going to isolate it to exactly where the watermelon is, so that's why I'm multiplying. So we have this noise, but only where this is. And then finally, since we already have this bump, all we have to do, again, like the vector displacement, like the mix RGB, is you add these ideas together, and then you get noise from a bunch of, what I'm trying to say is you get noise not only from this, but from the top. So what we can do to make this more intense, instead of just increasing the slider, which will make everything else more intense, we don't want that, is let's also multiply this before it reaches the addition. So we can make it intense like times 10. So now you can see we have a bit, it's kind of hard to see, especially with YouTube compression, I'm assuming, but we do have a tiny bit of detail that is going on over here. And in fact, what we can do is up the contrast for this, just so it's a bit more distinguished. So we bring the black up a bit, and you're starting to see some very dark areas and some very bright areas. And this is exactly what makes it look very, very bumpy. So there we go. We could also mess around with roughness, where the top is shinier than the exterior, or maybe the opposite. But since that's pretty easy, I want to move on to the next big idea, which is adding the seed. So far, what do we have? We have a cube. It's kind of cool seeing what the original cube would have looked like if we were to move those texture coordinates backwards in time. But we have a cube that transforms into a watermelon. So last step is adding in the seeds. Now, to add in the seeds, what we're going to do is kind of a new trick. So here's kind of like the big new idea. I mean, we've already gone over some new ideas, but here's the takeaway. This is what you're going to show to your mom when you're like, oh, how was school? You're going to be like, oh, this is what I learned. Okay. What we're going to be doing is a trick to scatter a single design, being a single seed, all over the surface of this. Okay. So to start off with, we're going to use Voronoi texture. This is just going to be the base, because what it does, let's scale this up, is it creates a procedural pattern that gives us these nice position vectors, where every fragment you're seeing here is a single XYZ vector, okay? Now, it's going to get confusing, so just try to follow along. I'm going to use object coordinates for the same reason as before, because of that whole transformation thing, so let's just connect this right here. What we're going to do is we are going to take this. No, don't add another. Absolutely don't do that. We're then going to subtract away the object coordinates. So really, it's kind of like the opposite. We have object coordinates minus the position of the Voronoi. And I'm going to explain what this is in a second. Don't worry. I know I know you're like shitting your diapers or something. It's not a big deal. Then what we're going to do is we're going to add in a multiplication using 110 just to suppress the z-axis, and that gives us this design. And I know what you're thinking. What is the point? Okay, so what are we doing here? So really what we have is a Voronoi texture that, again, the only reason we're using this is because of the fragment idea, where every fragment basically gives us the corresponding vector for the center of the fragment. Don't worry about it. But what this subtraction node is doing, and this is the key idea, is we're taking our object coordinates and basically offsetting them by a different amount corresponding to whatever fragment we're in. So again, object coordinates subtract the vector corresponding to each fragment. In other words, we've created kind of like a local, and this is a trick I learned from Gabe as well, maybe not in this exact context, but he uses this as well. So do a lot of people, but you know what? I guess Gabe invented everything. Why not? Basically, what this does is it makes a local texture space, object texture space coordinate system for each fragment, which I then got rid of the z-axis for, okay? And you're thinking, okay, we have the, okay. What's the point? The point is whatever design we make, we can put in every single fragment and control procedurally is the idea, okay? So let's make a basic seed. To do this, what I'm going to do is let's do, I guess the easiest way to do this is we're going to take this input and just output the length, okay? And right now it's not too obvious what this does. I guess you can kind of see it creates a little map that shows us where the center point of this is. It's not very useful right now, but I'm going to reshape these until they look like seeds, okay? So map arrange node, just so our output is inverted, so our output is 1, 0, not 0, 1. And then I'm just going to bring one of these down like this until we have a bunch of circles. So again, what map arrange node does is it takes an input interval like 0 to 1 or 0 to 0.03 and then outputs an interval. These numbers just so happen to give us what we want. Don't worry about the specifics. What we're then going to do is modify the stuff between here and here. So, you know, we have our manipulated texture space as if this was kind of like the first node, like this is your texture coordinates node. Whoops. As if this was your texture coordinates node, and then we're doing a whole bunch of stuff to it. We want to do stuff in between here. So first thing I'm going to do is let's multiply along like the X or Y axis or something. And as we do this, you see it's stretching each one individually because it's stretching the texture spaces, stretching them so that they are ellipses, just so they kind of look more like seeds. And we can work more on the shape, but this is just the general idea. Okay, you could go more ham with this. Next thing we're going to do is we want to have rotation, but not the same rotation everywhere. Have it be random. So what we're going to do, vector rotate. This is a node that was added in 2.83, I believe, for you historians. And one very convenient thing that the Voronoi texture does is it not only outputs the position vector, which we could use for what I'm about to do, but it also outputs a color for each fragment. In other words, a random vector, a random number for each fragment that we can use for the angle of the rotation, okay? I don't know what I was just talking about, but there was a quick mistake I want to correct before we continue. So I think what we had before, and this is, I get it, it's probably jarring for people who just saw this cut. You're like, wow, did you just teleport in time? I think what we had is we had the setup where we did, okay, we have the object coordinates and the scale down. Okay, I think I talked about this at length. We then, let's actually view the output. We then have this slider right here that controls the size or the aspect ratio of the seeds. And then I said, okay, vector rotate node after. Turns out this is not the order of operations you're going to do this in, because if we were to add something like a math multiply to just make this effect stronger, with the random vector that we get from each fragment, and let's multiply this by a large number, you're going to see that nothing really happens. And this is because you need to rotate before you scale. For a technical reason, yes, but it's true, believe me. So we're going to have this first, and then we are going to multiply by whatever aspect ratio may be, so something like 2, okay? And then, well, once you've fixed this grave mistake, you're going to see that the seeds are now randomly distributed in terms of rotation, where when this is set to 0, they're all going to have the same angle, and then we can increase the variation or the strength, right, of this this kind of rotation thing. And this is exactly the kind of thing that you definitely want to make a value slider. So let's take this, bring it down, and let's try to wrap up pretty soon because my voice is going, okay? So what we want to do is we want to take this, but say only have seeds where the red is, and I think we have a mask for that one. It should be this one, right? I believe it is this one. So we just take this, we multiply it again. Multiplication means have the same things at the same time, like seeds and where the seeds are supposed to be, okay? So just like before we were doing our mix RGB chain, we're just going to continue it where now we are going to mix our seed map. Let's put that in there. So let's see if that's working. It does seem to be working. And we are going to put our, let's see, black seeds there. And you're thinking, okay, these are the kinds of seeds that are phasing in and out of time. Why are they so blurred? It's because, again, it's because of this map range node. So we can just make that gradient less intense. Now, because this is driven by Voronoi, there are a couple benefits to this. First of all, if we change to 4-dimensional noise, yes, we can change the seed location procedurally. And this is, in fact, probably the coolest thing about this project. So we have seed distribution that you can change whenever you want, and it works with the, let's do the displacement. You can see we have our seeds, and they're going to phase in and out. Or are they going to stick onto there? Yeah, they should phase in and out as we do it, so that's kind of a cool byproduct. But we can not only, change the seed, we can change a couple other things like, the distribution, how many seeds we want. And by the way, and also, the type of distribution, grid versus something else. What I was going to say is, by the way, we should also consider if we have random location, rotation, maybe we should also have random scale. So in fact, we're going to use a scale node for that. Same idea from before, use this random number generator effectively to drive this. And you're going to notice that sometimes the seeds get a bit too big and leave their fragment, and there is a way to extend texture coordinates, but I don't know it, and even if I did, we're not going to talk about it right now. So just to make this less intense, we're going to do the reciprocal trick that we've talked about a couple times. So instead of getting bigger, it's going to get smaller, and when this is set to like some number, it's going to have nearly the same thing everywhere. I think when it's 0, although they're going to be huge, and then when we do this, we're going to have more variation, which is realistic because seeds don't all have the same scale. And if you are seeing a lot of this choppiness where the fragments are getting cut off and all that, just change the seed value, which we moved over here. Just change the seed value until you get something that you like more. Okay? Final thing we want to do is just incorporate this a tiny bit more with our effect. To do this, what we are going to do is we are going to take our seed map, which is this one, and we want to have it contribute to the bump. So again, like always, what we do is we take this, we add, and then we add what? We add in our, add in our seed map. So now very, very slightly, you can see that they're raised. And if you can't see it, you multiply it to make it more intense. There you go. Final thing, I guess, because I'm kind of getting over this whole watermelon thing, and you kind of know the essentials. It doesn't look great. But we do have control over everything that initially we had control over, like, the stripes and all those kinds of things, the Rhine. Final thing I want to talk about is just general trick for making it look better. And I think I talked about this before. What you always want to do, and this is just a very quick thing you can do that adds a lot of realism. What you do is you mix your final color before it reaches base color. We are going to mix it with black with the mode set to multiply, which right now is just going to give us, it's either going to give us black or the thing itself. And we want to say don't mix it everywhere, but do it based off a noise texture, okay? And what we can do is we can have this, be different, type of noise. The hiccups are getting bad. Something like this. And I know right now it's looking, kind of like an old, maybe a little moldy watermelon. To make it look better, just do math, do addition, and add, I guess in this case, a negative number, just so that we have this before. That's not looking very good. Let's make it a little less intense, just so we have this before and after. And this is just a good way to add variation. In fact, if you don't want to do just an addition slider, you can up the contrast on this noise, like this. And we want it to be very detailed and maybe a bit rough, just like that. And this is a good way to make a muddy looking watermelon. What you're going to do, again, same thing from before that I deleted, math, addition, and just make that way less intense. And this is just to add a very, very slight hint of color variation to make it look, slightly more realistic. You can definitely see it on the watermelon. Name of the game for the rest of this is changing, roughness and stuff like that. But I do think we're done. So just take your sliders, take everything else, Control G, call it a day. This is like when the teacher has 5 minutes left in the class and they're like, you know what, fuck it. we're going to throw it all on the board. And now we have, I don't know what it is we actually kept. We have the seed for the noise. Again, there's a lot of stuff from before that was exposed that we can make sliders here as well. We have whatever this is. What is this? This is the Rhine slider, I believe. I have no idea what this slider does, but it exists. I think this is the strength of the noise. We have our aspect, and then we have our valuable Rhine slider that you don't want to push too far. Okay, there you go. You've made a watermelon. Again, I would say it definitely doesn't look as good as the original, but that's the same with all of these. You put in more love, you put in more care, it will do exactly that. The original blend file for this one is going to be available on the Patreon, so you can see all those little caveats that maybe I didn't talk about, but Patreon exists. Seems like most of these tutorials end that way because you know what? Why put it in the middle, in the beginning where it's just annoying? Throw it in the end. It's a place to find what? It's a place to find Discord access, behind-the-scenes content, exclusive tutorials that aren't posted anywhere else. So you're getting the behind-the-scenes. I'm letting you peek behind the curtain again. Also the blend projects for stuff like this. Nodevember Day 3. This is turning out into quite the ride. I think tomorrow we have Grain. And to be honest, that's one I'm scared for. I don't know what I'm going to do for that, but we'll figure it out. Anyways, thank you to patrons, and there goes that. I don't know if you heard it, that automatic smell thing from before. Yeah, yeah, this is what it's called, going on for too long. So that's the show. See ya.